The curved swords are probably the most consistent weapon type across the entire Souls series. They're extremely light, have really fast movesets, and for most of the games, they actually offer you the highest DPS too. And recently, I actually did just do a Souls marathon beating all the games with a curved sword, and now I might as well just make a list going over the top 25 best ones across all the games. Now, unfortunately, not going to be including Bloodborne because there are no like weapon types in that game. Even though there might be some things that are similar to a curved sword, I'm not going to really bother with it. But the criteria is going to be based on how well it does perform in its own respective game and just for PvE too. Now to start off with, at number 25, we have the CARTHUS curved sword, which is one of a handful of bleed curved swords in Dark Souls 3. And out of all the ones that are not paired, this one is definitely going to be the best option. Now the downside is that it's still not going to be the highest damaging curved sword. Things like the Falchion and the Follower Sabre are going to output more damage in this thing. And when you're comparing it to things like obviously the SELLSWORD TWINBLADES and the WARDEN TWINBLADES with their cool dual wielding and paired moveset, they're also going to output more DPS, and the WARDEN's TWINBLADES is another one that can get bleed. But when it comes to the ease of use of a moveset like this one, and is having the option to proc bleed too, you can't really go wrong. Number 24, the Nox Flowing Sword, which is one of the shuttle-shaped types of curved swords in Elden Ring, and all these like shuttle curved swords tend to get some pretty poor damage, some poor range, but they will have the benefits of hitting around shields, which in this game is not really that useful, but the main reason why it gets to the top 25 is because of its unique skill in flowing form. For only 9 FP, it turns the weapon into like this big giant whip that extends the range by like 5 times the amount, does some very decent damage, staggers some larger enemies, does 22 stance damage, which is actually literally more stance damage than the Nox's Flowing Hammer unique skill for some stupid reason. And you're doing all this for only 9 FP. You can easily kill trash mobs, you can cheese many different types of bosses with this with how much range that it gets, and it's going to be on a curved sword, which Elden Ring curved swords have very quick movesets. The only downside that I can say about the Nox's Flowing Sword is that it only gets a dexterity scaling and cannot be infused nor buffed. A lot of the other curved swords can just outdamage this thing. I would have liked to see this weapon and the Nox's Flowing Hammer get the ability to be buffed. That would have been pretty nice, but it still is very solid. Number 23, the Storm Curved Sword, which is one of the longest curved swords that you can get in Dark Souls 3. Unfortunately, the damage is not really that good. A lot of the other ones, especially the infusible ones, can just straight up outdamage this, but it does also have another benefit in its unique skill in Tornado, which this skill is another reskin of Spin Slash, but it just like fires out this little bit of a wind-based AoE, which does actually make it do more stagger damage, some more poise damage, and it can send some smaller enemies flying. So against these smaller types of trash mobs and these smaller types of bosses, you can just infinitely stun lock them over and over again with this. And with how many enemies there are in this game that fall under this category, it could definitely be a very powerful option, especially with how little stamina it actually costs. Now the thing is, there are also some other weapons out there in Dark Souls 3 that might not have as good a stun lock potential, but combined with its more damage, it might end up being more useful. 22, the Crescent Moonsword, which is a dexterity and intelligence weapon from Dark Souls 3. It is going to have that shuttle type of design so it can bypass some shields, is extremely light, gets some okay amounts of damage, mainly going to scale best off dexterity, but the reason why it's going to get to the top 25 is because of its skill in Crescent Blade, which is like this really quick moonlight projectile attack that covers some nice distance, staggers pretty well. The damage isn't really the best as it is for like most weapon arts in Dark Souls 3, but the utility of having a nice projectile option, which is like a pure dexterity build, is honestly really nice because yeah, the skill actually does scale primarily off dexterity too, and you actually don't have to spec into any intelligence whatsoever because it doesn't actually get requirements there. Like the only downside that I can say is that it's just not going to get as much damage as some of the other infusible curved swords, and in this game obviously light attack spam is just king. At 21, the Follower's Sabre, which is one of the highest damaging infusible curved swords that Dark Souls 3 has to offer. Only gets a little bit less than the Falchion, but I'm going to prefer it a bit more than the Falchion because I like its weapon art better. In Prying Wedge, which if you haven't played Dark Souls 3, this was like the original sword dance. It does lunge into an enemy really quickly, can stun lock them. You get a follow-up attack for an additional 9 FP that can also output some nice damage. And I think it's a great complement to the weapon itself. Now in terms of boss damage, for like most weapon arts in Dark Souls 3, it's never going to be better than the straight R1 spamming. And if you actually wanted to have a really good R1 spamming curved sword, there are probably going to be some other weapons that are better. Number 20, the Demon Souls Falchion. Now the curved swords are probably the best weapon type in Demon Souls due to their insanely fast movesets. Those follow-up attacks are just ridiculously quick, can output some of the highest DPS too, probably just behind daggers, but they're obviously going to have some more range and better stagger potential. Now the thing is with weapons in Demon Souls, basically every single weapon gets the exact same moveset inside of its own category, and the only real differences between the weapons might be like base damage or scalings. And in this instance, the Falchion is just directly outclassed by the KILIJ in terms of scalings and damage, but the Falchion does have low requirements. You can get it early on. You can also get a Crescent infused Falchion very early on as well, and that one can be very easy to upgrade. You can just very well just pick up this weapon right at the beginning, clear out some parts of Area 4, have it almost maxed out, and you're just breaking the entire game open. Number 19, the Dancing Blade of RANAH, which is one of 3 paired curve swords to come out of the Elden Ring DLC. And paired curve swords, obviously getting the power sensing moveset is going to be a major benefit because this is probably the best power sensing combo in the entire game. It just gets ridiculous amounts of DPS, hits so many times in quick succession, and paired alongside the multi-hit talismans, you make for some of the most broken builds. Now the thing is, you're always going to get higher DPS with some of the infusible ones like Scavengers or the Bandit's curve sword, but the benefit of having a paired weapon means you only have to level up 1, and for this weapon in particular, it actually does get a unique skill in Unending Dance, which is just a whole bunch of like these cool flurry pirouette attacks that can just melt so many bosses really quickly. Now unfortunately, it's only really going to be useful against bosses that give you these longer openings, because otherwise you're not going to really be noticing much damage, but in that instance you could just use the regular movesets. But yeah, this whole weapon skill combo is just extremely deadly. You can hold on to it forever, and the more the attack persists with all these buffs active, you're just destroying everything in the entire game. And the reason why it's not going to get higher is because I do think the FALX can outclass this. It does get more damage at higher levels. It also gets access to bleed, and I think its weapon skill is more useful because it does get some better stun lock potential too. Number 18, the Red Rust Scimitar from Dark Souls 2. Now, Dark Souls 2 curve swords, I'm not really too big on, because I think for the most part they tend to be outclassed by katanas, as there will be similar types of damage and requirements, but katanas will just get more range, better movesets, and just get way higher counter damage too. So it kind of makes you not really value them as much. It's kind of the only game where that's the case. For basically every other game, I think I like the curve swords better than the katanas, which is actually pretty funny because bleed in this game kind of just sucks. But the Red Rust Scimitar is actually extremely good because not only does this thing get some stupid amounts of base damage, but it also is going to get 25 poise damage too, and with how fast the curve swords are, this could be one of the best poise breaking weapons in the game. And if you did have a strength build and you were lacking like a really quick option for some types of enemies, you could just leave this thing in your back pocket and switch to it because yeah, it does actually get a really good strength scaling. The only unfortunate downsides that I can say about this is that 1, it is like the heaviest curve sword in the game, and 2, it's probably just going to be eventually outclassed by the Warped Sword, because the Warped Sword also gets 25 poise damage, but just gets higher counter damage, better scalings, lighter weights, and better movesets, and also has the ability to be power sensed with larger types of weapons, just like the Red Rust Scimitar as well. So it's cool, but unfortunately, it just has to compete with like one of the best weapons in the game. Number 17, the Gold Tracer from Dark Souls 1's DLC, which is definitely one of the coolest looking curve swords in the entire series. That cool trail effect that it gets and its flashy ass moveset makes it very visually pleasing, and it also is extremely powerful because yeah, curve swords in Dark Souls 1, just like most of the other games, offer some of the highest DPS, and this thing also gets some bleed with really good scalings. So when you're fighting enemies weaker to bleed, there might be very little weapons out there that could probably melt them as quickly as this. In fact, the only one that probably could would be the Painted Guardian Sword, which this is also another curve sword that gets a very similar moveset, also gets bleed, but gets more damage, it's lighter, and can be buffed. So the Painted Guardian Sword is just going to directly outclass this, and is just going to melt enemies even quicker than this thing can. But obviously the Gold Tracer does get a bit more range. So if you were frustrated in using the Painted Guardian Sword because you just hated the range so much, then I probably would just use the Gold Tracer. It's unfortunate that it's like all the way at the end of the game, but it doesn't change the fact that it's really good. Number 16, ELEUM LOYCE, which is definitely one of the coolest curved swords in the entire series. Obviously, another one from Dark Souls 2, which as I mentioned with curved swords in Dark Souls 2, kind of wish they got a bit more counter damage. But ELEUM LOYCE in particular does get an S-scaling in dexterity, still has the ability to be infused and buffed. It doesn't weigh very much, and it also gets a unique heavy attack with this really quick poke. It can bypass shields, and it also heals you and allies. Now for my testing, the healing is roughly 250 HP. I kind of wish it was percentage healing, that would have been a lot cooler, especially with how late that you get it into the game. But for an example, if you do have roughly 40 vigor, it is going to heal for 15% of your health bar, which is still really solid, especially if you are fighting some of these late game DLC bosses. With how little openings they give you sometimes, it's always super annoying whether you're trying to decide to heal or use an attack, whereas this thing, you can just do both. Number 15, the Demon Scar, which is probably my favorite weapon in Dark Souls 3. It is a pure fire damaging curve sword that does double down as a pyromancy catalyst too. Does have a pretty cool skill on top of that, which is just like a reskinned version of Spin Slash, but it just leaves some lava on the ground. Now when it does come to weapon catalysts, they're never really that good or optimal by any means. You do lose out on having a heavy attack, but in this instance it doesn't really matter because curve sword heavy attacks are kind of just shit anyway. But the weapon damage and the spell damage are always going to be poor. A 30 intelligence faith Demon Scar is going to do less damage than a raw infused falchion, which that weapon doesn't even get any scalings and can be buffed. And compared to the other pyromancy flames, this one just gets the worst spell damage too. So if you actually wanted to use weapon and as spells, you're always just better off going in other direction when it comes to damage. But there is a couple of benefits that you do get with the Demon Scar, and that's one is going to be its combo potential. With how quick and easy it is to use certain types of spells directly after using some light attacks, you can make for some pretty deadly combos. And it's also just incredibly convenient too. Toggling between your spells can be a pain in the ass sometimes, and toggling between weapons on top of that can just be more annoying. Whereas this way, you can just two-hand the weapon, which is going to be a better moveset than having it one-handed. You don't have to switch back and forth. You're going to have a dedicated button for your spells, a dedicated button for your weapon attack, and you can just leave the grass crest shield on your back and just have a great time. Number 14, we have a QUELAAG'S FURYSWORD, which is probably the best boss weapon to come out of Dark Souls 1, as this is the longest range curved sword in the entire game. It honestly can get almost just as much range as some curved great swords, but it's still going to retain the exact same moveset as a regular curved sword, which in this game we actually do have some differing speeds. This one is going to be the slowest curved sword, but it's not really that noticeable at all, and it can still melt so many different enemies. Now the only other downside alongside its slightly slower moveset is that it's not going to get as much damage as some of the other curved swords. Basically every infusible curved sword can just out damage this thing, and doesn't result you in having to go level up a separate boss weapon. But the thing is with QUELAAG'S FURYSWORD, it actually does scale off humanity too, and when you do have 10 humanity on hand, you can get more damage than all the other curved swords if you don't account for buffs. And on top of all that, it looks really cool too. Number 13, the FALX, which is another curved sword to come out of the Elden Ring DLC, which just like the Dancing Blade of RANAH, it's going to get that same power stance curved sword moveset, which is just incredible. It's not going to get as much damage as the Dancing Blade of RANAH with a pure dexterity build, but at higher levels when you're going to spec in some more strength, this one can just output more damage and just get bleed on top of that. Now it can't be infused nor buffed, so if you're going to compare it to like a power stance Bandit's curved sword or a power stance Scavenger's curved sword, it's not going to get as much DPS. So with those jumping attack builds or running attack builds, they're going to perform way better, but it actually does have a very useful skill that complements the weapon very nicely, as a Ranger's Blade can lunge into an enemy really quickly, stagger them nicely, and have a follow-up attack that can stun lock them even better, proc bleed really quickly, help proc the multi-hit talismans too. Like there are so many enemies that can be completely destroyed by a skill like this, unless they do have very small openings, but in that instance, you can just use your bleed power stance curved sword moveset. Number 12, the Large Sword of Searching, which is a Demon Souls curved sword, and in this game, curved great swords did not exist, and therefore, this weapon can still be classified as a regular curved sword, benefits of the same really quick movesets, but just have ridiculous amounts of range. Now, just like all the other weapons that have really good range, as I mentioned on this list, they're always going to have a trade-off in damage, and it is definitely true here as well. It does get really good base damage, but its scalings are very poor, and it is a boss weapon that cannot be upgraded any further. It just stays at +0, so like a New Game Plus and beyond, you're definitely going to be noticing that it has a dramatic fall off. But in this regular New Game, compared to things like the KILIJ and the FALCHIon, it's not that much less damage, but you're getting like twice as much range. And not having to worry about leveling up a boss weapon sometimes can just be really nice to have. And if you're just doing like a random New Game playthrough, this can be one of the best weapons to use. But yeah, obviously, as I mentioned, its lack of damage at later levels, and with how heavy it can weigh as well, I'm still not going to value it as the best curved sword in this game. Pontiff Knight curved sword, the infamous PKCS. Yes, if this was like a PvP list, I'd put it a lot higher because in PvP, these curved swords are just insanely fast, and it is somewhat unreactable sometimes, especially due to the lag. And the Pontiff Knight curved sword literally gets the most range in class, so combined with a phantom range, it just makes it even more broken. But in PvE, it's still really solid as well because, as I mentioned, it does get the most range. It is a pure dexterity scaling curved sword with some of the highest damage, and it does have a pretty decent skill as well in Frostblade, which does extend the range of the weapon by like 3 times the amount, and does this nice frost-based attack that can stagger these larger enemies very well, hits multiple enemies at the same time, and send some of these enemies flying too. And on top of all that, it actually can proc frost. Unfortunately, you only get frost with the skill itself, so you have to spam it a whole bunch if you do want to be able to proc the status effect. But when it comes to the straight up R1 spamming, it does really well. When it comes to crowd control, it does really well. When it comes to stun locking, it does that well too. Like, there's not really much bad you can say about it. It's like a solid S tier. Number 10, the Magma Blade, which is a really good strength faith-based weapon in Elden Ring. Does offer some really high amounts of AR. Does get the regular curved sword moveset, which is nice, but its weapon skill in Magma Shower is just busted and broken. It's just a reskin version of Spinning Slash. Same animation, same stance damage and all that stuff, but it just leaves a whole bunch of magma on the ground, which is going to make it do ridiculous amounts of damage. And now, as of the DLC releasing, we have the Talisman of the Dread, which this talisman helps boost the skill by 15%, and that's going to stack with the Shadow of Alexander, and everything is just going to get destroyed. Doesn't even matter if they resist fire damage too. Number 9, the WARDEN TWINBLADES, which is one of 3 separate paired curved swords in Dark Souls 3, one being the SELLSWORD TWINBLADES, and the other one is, yeah, I don't want to talk about that piece of shit. But most other paired weapons in Dark Souls 3 are basically just broken. They just offer you some of the highest DPS, really good stagger potential, really good poise damage as well. Like, if there is a weapon class that has a paired variant, more likely than not, that's going to be the best weapon in that category. And that's definitely true for the curved swords too. The WARDEN TWINBLADES are just broken. Not going to get as much damage as the SELLSWORD TWINBLADES, obviously, but it actually does does give you some passive bleed. So when you are fighting some enemies that are weaker to bleed, this one actually can outperform the SELLSWORD Twin Blades. Now the problem is that just like most other Souls games, there are a lot of bosses that are just immune. So for a big chunk of the game, you're not going to really benefit as much of having this one as you would the SELLSWORD Twin Blades, especially because you get that one earlier in the playthrough, but this weapon can literally be just as broken. Number 8, the Scavenger's Curved Swords. Now, as I kind of talked about with the Warden Twin Blades, kind of like the equivalent of that, in that this is like an infusible bleed-based curved sword. Obviously not going to get the highest amount of damage, but it does give you the option of getting some bleed, which if you go ahead and grab a second one of these, pairing it alongside an occult infusion with seppuku, it's going to output some of the highest DPS, if not the highest DPS in the entire game. Now, yes, the Bandit's Curved Sword can actually output some more damage with like keen infusions and a bleed infusion too, but if you actually wanted to proc bleed really quickly, then seppuku is going to do it for you. If you actually wanted to maximize the damage of some bleed-based skills like Blood Blade or Bloody Slash, then having the occult infusion is the way to go, which the Scavenger's Curved Sword is going to benefit way more as it does already have that passive bleed. So even though it might be outclassed in some areas, it definitely fills its own niches to warrant it being a very high S tier. Number 7, the Dark Souls 1 Falchion. Now the Falchion is honestly really good in every single game. It's always consistently some of the highest damage, but once you get to like some of the later entries, it tends to be outclassed by some other types of options because they probably have some like really cool movesets, some better stats, or maybe like a really cool skill. But in games like Demon Souls or Dark Souls 1, where there's nothing really fancy like that, the Falchion is going to be like a really good staple weapon because yeah, this weapon can be acquired very early on in the game. It's not going to weigh very much. It's going to have a great moveset. It's not going to have bad range at all, and it's just going to have some of the highest damage. Like you can't really go wrong. Like the only weapons that could probably output more damage in a curved sword would probably be the Painted Guardian curved sword, but if you actually didn't like the really poor range the Painted Guardian sword has, then I would just use the Falchion instead. Number 6, the Bandit's Curved Sword, which is the best infusible curved sword in Elden Ring. And with the curved sword class in this game, having them one-handed or two-handed, I'm not going to like them as much as katanas, because katanas will probably end up getting better variations of movesets, better skill options, also get passive bleed too. But when you do have the curved sword's power stance, that's when they tend to be like some of the best and most broken options, because every single attack just hits with the weapon simultaneously. The jumping attacks and running attacks hit like 4 times in like an instant, and with all these multi-hit talismans and buffs, you can make completely broken builds. Doesn't matter what infusion or what type of build you pair it alongside with, the Bandit's Curved Swords are just consistently going to be some of the best weapons. The only downside is that you do have to farm for it, and as I recommended, having them power stance is going to be optimal, so it might be a bit of a pain in the ass to try and farm sometimes. Number 5, the KILIJ, which is probably the best curved sword in Demon Souls, and as I mentioned, I think the curved sword weapon class is the best in this game too. It doesn't necessarily make it the best weapon, but it's easily top 5, because it does get the highest damage out of all the curved swords, it still has the exact same really fast moveset, it gets passive bleed like all the other curved swords too, although bleed in Demon Souls is kind of just shit. You can also get it very early on, like the only downside is that it does have a bit higher of a strength requirement compared to some of the other curved swords, but the positives in it having a bunch more damage is just well worth it. Number 4, the Dark Souls 1 Painted Guardian Sword, which this weapon gets like the highest DPS in the entire game. Does get that really quick curved sword moveset. Its heavy attack is a nice flurry too, very similar to the Gold Tracer. It can be buffed and infused at higher dexterity levels. It can even outdamage things like the Falchion. And on top of all that, it also gets passive bleed. And there are a handful of enemies and bosses in this game that can be bled out. And this thing is just going to be an absolute monster and machine. The only downside and the obvious downside is going to be its range. Like it has basically dagger types of range, which can be very annoying sometimes. You have to be like basically right on top of the enemy just to benefit. So if range was like a big downside for you, as I mentioned before, going with things like the Falchion or the Gold Tracer can be a nice alternative. But the weapon just offers stupid amounts of damage. At number 3, we have the Warped Sword. Now, as I've been mentioning with Dark Souls 2 curved swords, don't really care for them much because I'd rather have katanas for the most part, but the Warped Sword is a very special exception because this thing offers 130 counter damage and 25 poise damage too, which is just ridiculous, especially for a really good damaging, high dexterity scaling curved sword, because the movesets are insanely fast. So not only are you going to benefit of having a higher chance to get a counter hit, but you're probably going to benefit of really fast poise breaks too. Like there's practically no downsides to this weapon. It's fast, it's really light, and it also gets a pretty cool moveset as well, especially when power stance. That L2 can be like a really nice flurry attack. So whether you're building around this thing with a power stancing build or just having it one-handed or two-handed, it's still going to be a broken option and make for one of the best weapons in Dark Souls 2. Number 2, the Wing of ASTEL, which is the best curved sword in Elden Ring, and probably the best stance-breaking weapon in this game too. It's a pretty decently damaging dexterity and intelligence-based weapon. Does get the regular curved sword moveset, except for its heavy attack, which actually also doubles down as a projectile attack, which having a free projectile attack that doesn't consume any FP is good enough as it is, but at point blank range, it makes it do so much more stance damage, to the point that it gets just as much stance damage as a fully charged heavy attack of a colossal weapon. But funnily enough, the thing that's actually best about this weapon when it comes to the stance breaking and potentially even the damage is going to be its skill in and Nebula. For only 20 FP, it shoots out this little magic AoE attack right in front of you that explodes so many times. This can actually stun lock enemies, do really good damage, and if all these explosions hit, it could do upwards of 50 stance damage, which is just stupid because you can spam it over and over again. You can combo in your heavy attack, and with all these things combined, you're stance breaking faster with this thing than almost anything else. And it's not like it has a trade-off in damage, like the damage is actually insane too. And you also benefit of it being a curve sword, so if you wanted to, you can go ahead and throw in like a second one in your offhand and just gain the benefits of the really broken power sensing combo. But you don't really need it because the rest of the weapon is arguably more broken. And that's number one. I'm sure to nobody's surprise, we have the SELLSWORD TWINBLADES, which is probably the best curve sword in the entire series, and it probably is the best weapon in the entirety of Dark Souls 3 as well. As I mentioned, with all paired weapons in this game, they're just utterly broken. Kind of makes me wonder if like power sensing was actually in that game, how good it actually would be. Because this, alongside a lot of other paired weapons in this game, can just offer some stupid amount of damage for not really much downside, because you're still leveling up one weapon to gain the ability to dual wield, and it's not going to really weigh that much more, not really consume much more stamina, and not even be that slower as well. Like these movesets are really fast, and you're swinging two of them. You can just keep spamming the light attacks if you wanted to. The weapon arts is also pretty useful at stun locking as well. Like if you were to compare it to like the power sensing variant in Elden Ring, I think the Elden Ring movesets are better. And if that moveset was in this game, it'd probably just make it for an even better weapon. But when it comes to how good the weapon is for its particular game, I think the SELLSWORD is the best in the entire series. Okay, that's now completed. It is always nice to go back to the older games and just make some Soulsborne types of content. It has been a while since I've had made some videos like this. If this stuff does interest you, just let me know down in the comments below what type of weapon category you would like for me to rank next. And also follow me on Twitch because that's where I do all of my runs as well. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.